We're gonna take our time, slow down and design. Yeah.
So you spoke about 3D printing, and earlier this year I heard Janine Benyus of Biomimicry talk a lot about her concerns about 3D printing if we're not using polymers that nature would use. Can you talk a little bit about that, and have you done any work around that, using 5 basic polymers rather than all these man-made ones?
Yeah, the question about 3D printing, I'm sort of an agnostic at this point. I'm taking a wait-and-see attitude because I'm skeptical about the embodied energy in that process and whether you can justify it on an energy return on investment basis. I think that still needs to be shown. And also the question of non-renewable resources that may go into that. It's a perfect place to be exploring those questions in a village like Clogjordan, where they have these ethical principles and they're studying it from the standpoint, oh, well, let's take it in a direction that is sustainable and is responsible and doesn't pollute and does have good energy return on investment. So they're sort of taking that concept of the Fab Lab to another notch up and putting it through these filters. Enrique? Okay, where's the microphone? Okay, there.
Can you talk a little bit more about the difference between a rocket stove design and the biochar design?
Yeah, there's a lot of effort going into rocket stoves, but actually, if you go to the places where they do the stove camps, Aprovecho and others around the world, you see that in the last 5 years, the interest has been in these smokeless carbon sequestering stoves, which are as efficient or more efficient than rocket stoves. So it's the next generation of design. And so the idea of sort of baking your material instead of burning it, instead of oxidizing it, you're burning in the absence of oxygen. What that does is it pushes the gases, it pushes all the different elements out of the carbon structure, and then those gases can be saved and burned later, or they can be burned right then. If you choose to burn them right at that moment, from a permaculture standpoint, we want to think about, is that waste heat? Where is it going? Is it just warming up the atmosphere more? Can't we use that heat to do something? That's energy. Why waste it? So let's tack on some more processes. Let's heat some water. Let's cook some food. Let's make something with that heat. Yeah. So the rocket stove is all well and good for being more efficient than a traditional cook stove, and that's a good step. But let's take it another step and make it carbon sequestering and very heat efficient. Yeah.
So Albert, just a quick question. In the built environment, there's this interesting movement to get back to wood buildings, as long as it's done in conjunction with very responsible forest management. They're getting up to buildings up to 15 stories using wood again, and the argument is you can use it for carbon sequestration, right? And my question to you is if you have any thoughts about that. Have you seen these buildings, their performance? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's excellent, and anything you can make of wood. If you can make a wooden boat, wooden furniture, anything that's made of wood or bamboo or grasses, that keeps it from the short-term cycle. So the normal carbon cycle is going to take 12 or 15 years as it goes from a dying plant or tree back into the ground and then into the gas, into the atmosphere, and then it's going to get rained back down, taken up by another generation of plants. Let's short-circuit that. Let's make that time, that residence time in the ground, 1,000 years or 10,000 years instead of, and let's put it in a building. The building might last 100 years, or if it's well built, it'll last longer. I was at Tikal, the Mayan ceremonial city, monumental architecture and pyramids, and they had timbers that were still intact in a tropical rainforest after 400 or 500 years? How could that be? They were holding up lentils over doors and windows. How could that be, these timbers? And the answer was they charred them. Yeah? They charred them. And that they formed a hard matrix of hard, woody solids that were not susceptible to decay. So yeah, this is another step you could take. If you're building a wooden building and you want to go 10 stories high, think about charring the wood first. Yeah?
Right up. I got to say, thank you so much for that incredibly inspiring talk there. And my sympathies to the translators for the Permi lexicon that you just employed.
Yeah.
I've been rather excited about biochar, and some of the pushback and concerns that I get from people when I try to hype it, I'd like to put to you to hear your response on and thoughts on these. First, just the scale that we need to address the climate crisis and how we can realistically get there is a basic question we get. But then also how biochar is conflated with the concerns of biomass and the deforestation that came with the, when biofuels became commercialized and such. And then also the push by so-called green capitalists to seek intellectual property rights on, the improvements that should be disseminated as quickly as possible.
And I would add to that the conflation of biochar with geoengineering. Yeah? And I address all of these in my book because I think it's important that we look at the critics and what are the criticisms, and are they serious, and what do we need to think about. And I think Biofuels Watch and others are very good in monitoring and watching the ethics of this as it moves forward. I have the same questions that Vandana Shiva and others have about industrial scale. And that's why I tend to work at appropriate technology scale, village scale, rather than these giant industrial plants that are co-generating heat and energy from biomass. And I don't like the idea of biofuel crops either. I don't want to compete with traditional crops and polycultures and those kinds of things. I don't like having monocultured fields and various things, especially genetically modified eucalypts. But so what I want to do is I want to find waste products to use, and this is where we point to the cacao husks and the coconut husks. And in Australia, they did a study. Joey, my friend Stephen Joseph, did a study, and he saw that as fast as you can imagine biochar ramping up in Australia, as big as an industry as it could become, you could feed the entire industry from just 2 waste streams: paper mill wastes and chicken litter. Okay? Just that in Australia. Well, I'm not a fan of either paper mills or confined poultry operations. So I don't know if that's very sustainable. But that's the idea, is to go and look for waste streams and intercept those. Yeah. So if you have a forest industry around you, chances are there will be sawmills, there will be furniture factories, there will be places where there are big piles of sawdust and wood chips. If you're in a rice area, you have rice husks. Rice husks make excellent biochar. Yeah? So begin to think about that. Can we take rice husks that will become methane if left in the atmosphere or burned into carbon dioxide and turn that into biochar, which goes into the garden, yeah, and stays for 1,000 years? That's intercepting the short cycle with a much longer cycle.
Kevin Danner with Global Exchange in San Francisco, and thanks for the great presentation. I'd be very interested in hearing your opinion of how we could incorporate all of these brilliant methodologies into a global campaign to plan the transition of Guantanamo Naval Base from a torture center into an eco-university that would train people in these technologies from all around the world.
Well, I almost don't need to respond to that, but I would say that I think the first thing is to get the current tenant to honor the lease that was expired after 99 years.
So I've been following the progress of Savadaya Shramadana in Sri Lanka that you mentioned for the past 30 years, and it is an exponential multiplication of effectiveness. And I want to know from you, what are the principles they're working with that you reckon would be applied globally for eco-village development? You know, why might that not happen in some places? What are the obstacles for that?
As I understand you, Ravina, you were asking about the development of eco-villages and how to expand that.
Just in the model of Savadaya, why does that work so effectively and why is it so slow elsewhere?
I'm sorry, I'm just having a hard time hearing you.
Okay, so Savadaya, why does it work so effectively, so fast?
Your microphone keeps dropping out.
Okay, Savadaya Shramadana.
Yes.
Why so good? Why so fast? Why everywhere else so slow?
Yeah, good. Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, so Sarodia was started by a follower of Mahatma Gandhi, Aryayatna, who came back to Sri Lanka in the 1950s. You could say why is it so fast? Well, let me think now. 1950 to 2013, it took a little while to get going at Sarodia. He had to demonstrate for a number of years that these ideas actually could work. He had to be able to integrate the Vipassana Buddhism into a culture of an active civil war with a oppressed minority, which is actually a majority. And so for him, the process was very slow and methodical, but once he had the examples and they were thriving and moving on and adopting others, you know this familiar curve of exponential function, right? So now we can talk about 18,000 villages or 1 million people living in them. In the 1950s, 1960s, we could only talk about a much smaller number. But it's in an exponential curve because each one adopts another and each one, each year, grows out from its surrounding area. So in this way, we are still very much at the beginning. Permaculture, eco-villages, carbon farming, we're just at the beginning of the curve. But it's infectious, and that's the whole idea here, is to make it viral and make it infectious.
So I'm pretty new to the biochar thing, so can you kind of explain it in simpler terms? Do you have to have a specific biochar stove? Can you essentially burn a bunch of organic material over a bonfire, and is the remains biochar?
Yeah. Now, I have 2 words for you, YouTube. And every week there are more YouTube videos posted that show people who are learning to make biochar and use it in various ways. You don't need a biochar producing stove. You can burn it, you can make a hole in the ground and put bamboo in it and create charcoal. I know people who do that and they sell the biochar that way. But frankly, I'm looking for maybe, if I'm going to do a pit in Hawaii with bamboo to make biochar, I want a suckling pig to put in the pit so that it has stacked functions, yeah? So some other uses, right? So the idea there is to be able to make it from lots of different ways. And maybe you're heating your house, or maybe you're making hot water, or maybe you're doing other things, and you're making biochar at the same time. These little thermocouples, the technology that this uses to make electricity is amazing. And we're starting to get, these couples of different metals, bimetallics, coming together to make electricity. So you can imagine putting a thermocouple on any heat-producing device, the back of your refrigerator, the chimney on your house. Anywhere that there's a little bit of heat all the time, a solar application of any kind, you get electricity. And maybe you store that in a capacitor if it's a very small amount, or you store it in a battery if it's a larger amount. And so now you begin to use the heat many times over. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for such an inspiring talk, Albert. I wanted to ask you about biochar. Biochar, you're talking about biochar as being a very good thing to put back carbon down in the earth. Is there any way that biochar can help to clean radioactivity in any way? Because we have these power plants, these nuclear power plants, like in Japan, bringing a lot of radioactivity to the Pacific Ocean. I know that there are some plants like totora, reedweed, that absorb radioactivity. Can you tell us something about it?
Yes, this is being done, actually. There's a lot of experimentation right now on radioactivity and biochar in soils as a remedial agent or a chelating agent. Paul Stamets is doing some of this work himself. And part of that is the fungus, so that fungal growth immediately speeds up when you put biochar in soil, and funguses create this waxy substance as they externally digest their food. They bioaccumulate particular minerals, so if you have strontium or you have cesium, some things are bioaccumulated, and then you can harvest that particular individual and remove that. However, it does not ameliorate, it doesn't get rid of, it doesn't completely heal. Radioactivity is not going away. It's going to go on its decay chain for 1 million years. But you can accumulate it using biological means. So if you put soil amendments like biochar, you speed up the process of drawing minerals from the roots. Then you harvest those plants and you can sequester those plants, put them in a containment to take them out of the soil. In that way you can clean the soil. And not just radioactivity, but heavy metals, lots of things. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Albert. And we'll take our time, slow down and design.